August is here, and that means that the weather and the election cycle are heating up. The best way to beat the heat and stay up to date on the latest news from the US election to international breaking headlines is to become a DSR member and gain access to additional content across our network, in addition to other exclusive benefits. Use code BEATTHEHEAT to get 50% off of your membership and sign up today at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. That's Beat the Heat at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. Now please enjoy the show.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. Kamala Harris's campaign just released a harsh new ad attacking Donald Trump's plans for a second term by invoking the Project 2025 blueprint and airing Trump's vow to prosecute his enemies for revenge. This ad is notable because it frontally goes after Trump's nakedly corrupt intent should he win in a way that has real force. Which raises a question: why aren't we seeing more discussion of Trump's corruption in this campaign? Today we're talking about this with David Sirota, the editor-in-chief of The Lever. Sirota's news outlet just launched a strikingly ambitious podcast called Master Plan, which documents over a half-century of legalized corruption in Washington. We'll talk about that, too. Welcome, David.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Okay, first let's listen to a snippet from Kamala Harris's new ad, which talks about Project 2025, the blueprint for corrupt authoritarian governance that Trump's allies are drawing up.
A 922-page blueprint to make Donald Trump the most powerful president ever. Overhauling the Department of Justice. Giving Trump the unchecked power to seek vengeance. Eliminating the Department of Education. And defunding K-12 schools. Requiring the government to monitor women's pregnancies and severe cuts to Medicare and Social Security. Donald Trump may try to deny it, but those are Donald Trump's plans.
Well, revenge does take time, I will say that. And sometimes revenge can be justified.
What this ad is really talking about is the plan by Trump and his allies to use every lever of power they can toward deeply corrupt ends. The threat to hijack the Justice Department to carry out corrupt prosecutions of opponents is only the most visible thing here. David, wouldn't it be nice if we heard more talk like this in our political campaigns these days?
I mean, I do think that getting Donald Trump, his agenda, on the agenda and in the discourse is really, really important. And I think that we, in a sense, we're lucky that Project 2025 was written down in 922 pages of detailed policy proposals. And it's really important for folks to understand that at the very top of Project 2025, they are very clear in saying that this is an agenda designed to be plug and play and to be implemented the moment Trump would be sworn in as president in January of 2025. These aren't some platitudes. This isn't, by the way, it's not some random group either that's just kind of throwing it out there. I mean, this was crafted with the support of at least 140 former Trump officials, including some cabinet secretaries. And it is put out there by the Heritage Foundation, which is basically the most powerful conservative think tank in America, that's been publishing these plug-and-play agendas for conservative presidents for decades. We can talk more about that. Point being that this is not some campaign propaganda. This is like what exactly they would do. Now, I know Trump has tried to say, hey, suddenly, hey, this is not my agenda. I don't really support Project 2025. I mean, that's a whole lot of nonsense, too, and we can talk more about that as well.
It certainly is. I mean, the Harris campaign and Democrats have done some stuff on Project 2025, nothing quite like this ad. But in addition to Project 2025, there's all this other Trump corruption and elite dealing to talk about. For instance, we recently learned that Trump solicited $1 billion in campaign contributions from big oil executives while openly promising to do their bidding in office. Trump has similarly promised roomfuls of big donors that he'll keep their taxes low. Is there a way to make this kind of thing politically matter a bit more, maybe more salient?
Well, I would say yes, but I worry no. Okay, so yes, I think that polls tell us that the public implicitly understands that the political system is a morass of corruption, that money talks, that we live in the post-Citizens United era where money talks. I think and so when people see Donald Trump or they read about Donald Trump being so brazenly transactional, I think it's at once grotesque, but it's also in a sense not surprising to people. Yeah. So when I say no, that this might not become salient in the election, I think what I'm saying is that I fear that we've become inured to this kind of corruption, that we've become numbed to it, that we are living in a sense we're the fish in the David Foster Wallace speech. If you know that speech, one fish swims by the other fish and says, "Hey, how's the water?" And the fish says, "What's water?" Point being, I wonder if corruption has become so endemic that more and more voters don't notice it, don't care about it, or simply think that it's so normalized that it's not corruption anymore. It's just what politics is. Now, I find it grotesque. I find it unacceptable. And maybe this speaks to my age. I can remember a time when, yes, politics always has corruption around it, but it wasn't so out in the open. It wasn't so explicit. It wasn't so proudly boasted about. I mean, let's remember, Donald Trump gave a speech bragging about Elon Musk, giving him, according to him, $45 million a month, right? I mean, he was at a speech at a rally. This wasn't some, smoky back room. He's actually bragging about it. So I wonder if, are we numbed to that now? That's my fear.
Well, that brings us to your new project, which documents well over a half century of this stuff. The thing about Trump's shakedown of big oil executives is that it's a pretty clear quid pro quo that very well might also be legal. What makes your project kind of so innovative is that it seeks to document a history of legalized corruption and how it got entrenched in Washington over the course of so many decades. Can you take us through what you found?
Sure. So the story kind of starts in the aftermath of Watergate. Watergate was, everyone knows the break-in. That's been documented in Hollywood, in movies, et cetera, et cetera. I think what a lot of people forget is that Watergate was the country's, the modern era's first major campaign finance scandal. The Congress had just passed the Federal Election Campaign Act in 1972, and Richard Nixon immediately went to work to try to undermine that law at the same time that the Watergate break-in was going on. There's a fascinating tale of Nixon trying to undermine the campaign finance law that he himself signed. Watergate happens. It's in part funded by illegal campaign contributions from major brand name corporations and their executives. And part of the Watergate prosecution was actually prosecuting those executives. Now, amid all of this corruption, Congress ultimately passes the amendments to the Federal Election Campaign Act. These are the landmark. We're going to strengthen this legislation. We're going to toughen anti-corruption laws in the country. But at the very same time, the conservative movement was plotting. And we talk a lot about something called the Powell Memo. Lewis Powell was a lawyer, sort of an establishment guy, head of the American Bar Association, but he was also an arch conservative. And he wrote a memo for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in which he said, we have a serious problem, essentially. The government has become too responsive to the small d, democratic pressures being put on us by the movements of the time, Ralph Nader and the like. And business needs to do a lot better job of influencing and really owning the political system. And what he focused on in that memo was judicial action, aka stacking the courts. And out of that came a set of task forces at the Chamber of Commerce, and this has not been reported, There's been a lot of, frankly, a lot of questions about, well, how influential was the Powell memo? What we uncovered is there were task forces comprised of some of the country's most powerful corporate executives in which they outlined different ways they were implementing the Powell memo, with one focus being on campaign finance. And what they ended up doing is they ended up inserting loopholes into those post-Watergate reforms that allowed for the explosion of business PACs, corporate PACs, which exploded. And look, it's hard to summarize all of this, but the other important thing that happened in this era, they also focused on enshrining the then radical legal doctrine that money doesn't buy votes, that money is constitutionally protected speech. This was a big focus. Out of this Powell memo movement came the famous Buckley v. Valeo case.
And that takes us to where we are today, really, in some ways.
Essentially, two things happened. It was Buckley v. Valeo, by the way, fun fact, masterminded by none other than John Bolton. John Bolton, the same John Bolton. And after the Buckley v. Valeo case enshrined the idea that money is not corruption, money is constitutionally protected speech, then came a little-noticed decision at the time called Bellotti, which was engineered behind the scenes by Lewis Powell. And Bellotti extended those constitutional free speech protections to corporations. Bellotti was the foundation for Citizens United, which Citizens United, written by the direct successor to Lewis Powell, Anthony Kennedy, who, another fun fact, what had been part of his early career as a corporate lobbyist. So this is a direct through line to legalize corruption. And one other thing that's worth saying here is some may say, well, why is it necessary to legalize corruption? This is a very important point. It's because corruption is the way, money is the way to essentially short-circuit the democracy. If you want to do things that the public doesn't want done by its representative government, then what you have to try to do is use disproportionate money to have disproportionate power, to effectively short-circuit that one person, one vote paradigm that's supposed to prevent that. So when we see Donald Trump out there saying, give me money and I will give you policy, that is something that used to be considered corruption. It used to be, in some cases, considered illegal corruption and certainly culturally deplorable. I mean, we had the Keating 5 scandal.
That's key.
Right?
The
Keating 5 scandal was senators pressuring a federal regulator on behalf of their donor. That was considered outrageous. Now we are in an era where not only is that kind of corruption legalized, it seems culturally acceptable. And to me, that's the final stage of the master plan.
Yeah, and what you really got out there very well is that Trump kind of represents the culmination of this in many ways. For instance, he essentially campaigned in 2016 on the very idea that the system is corrupt, and he knows it because he corrupted the system. He participated. And he would put that knowledge of the corrupt system to work for his voters, which was all bullshit, another scam. But this was the product of over half century of history. And people, just to give you a taste of what this new podcast is like, here's a little snippet. It discusses how John Connolly, a little-known figure during Watergate, shook down dairy companies for campaign contributions in exchange for administration favors as Nixon's Treasury Secretary. Listen.
And Nixon says that in exchange for that big favor, Connolly is going to squeeze the dairy companies for even more cash than what they were already funneling to Nixon's political machine.
He knows it well, and he's just shaking it down. And maybe he's shaking for a little more for him. See what I mean?
Did you hear that? Listen to it again.
And he's just shaking it down.
Yes, he's literally talking about, quote, shaking them down.
David, when I read about Trump and big oil executives and I listen to that, I feel like we haven't come very far since then.
I know, except the thing is that when that tape from Nixon came out, it was considered a big scandal. I mean, there were headlines. It was an outrage. It helped fuel the Congress at the time to pass that original Federal Election Campaign Act, right? I mean, it was salient, is I think what I'm trying to say, right? It was a big deal. Now, you fast forward 50 years, Trump is literally caught saying, "I will give you policy, you a set of oil executives, for $1 billion," essentially making a deal. And it's, a 1 or 2 days story. It's sort of like, oh, that's Trump being Trump. And I think we have to step back and say, wait a minute. This is not normal. This is not natural. And the other thing we have to say is it doesn't have to be this way. I think in reporting this series, one thing that I keep coming back to is it's not to say that the past era was perfect. It's not to say that at all. I mean, there's always been corruption. But it is to say the pervasiveness of the corruption that we live in today, the tolerance for it, the acceptance of it, the normalization of it is brought about by specific decisions from specific people who had a specific agenda. And I think the silver lining then is that if you can create this system, both legally with the rulings that we talked about, Citizens United, Buckley, et cetera, if you can create that, then you can also start to unwind it. It's not a force of nature. There are specific things that can be done to make our system less driven by money, to make money less politically determinative.
One of the big stories that I think you're getting at here is that the reform architecture that was put in place after Watergate has just kind of proven insufficient, both when it comes to, in broad terms, but also when it comes to Trump, right? I mean, in a way, to sort of build on your point about how Trump represents a culmination of all this, Project 2025 is itself kind of an effort to brush aside that post-Watergate architecture once and for all, isn't it? I mean, it calls for the demolition of the independence of the civil service, the wrecking of DOJ independence. Those are things that were secured by, as you say, decision makers and reformers who did the right thing. Can you talk about that? Is that a way to understand Project 2025?
It's a very astute point, and you're absolutely right. I mean, Mandate for Leadership, which was the first version of Project 2025. Officially, Project 2025 is I think the 9th installment of the Mandate for Leadership series. Originally, it was a reaction to essentially the New Deal and the Great Society and the reforms of the post-Watergate era. That is almost explicitly what it was at every level on every policy. So in a sense, that's what it's doing. And I think when you look at the granular details, you can see, even in Project 2025, the continued effort to further legalize corruption. Right. If you read the sections on the Federal Election Commission, if you read the sections on the IRS, et cetera, about trying to further hamstring what's remaining of any campaign finance and anti-corruption architecture, that is the vision they have: a completely deregulated campaign finance system, a completely neutered, defanged law enforcement apparatus aimed at corruption. And it dovetails, of course, again, I go back to the court rulings, right? I mean, Buckley v. Vallejo, to Citizens United, all the way to the Bob McDonnell cases, the Cuomo cases, the case in Indiana from the last term, which effectively legalized explicit bribery, the giving of gifts to politicians in exchange for their favors. All of this comes together to a vision of the conservative vision of a society in which money rules everything. There are no strictures on it. There are no prohibitions against its use in the political arena. And when I look at that vision, I mean, it's a pretty dystopian vision, right? I mean, it is a dark vision. But I agree with you also that it also says that what came out of the post-Watergate reforms were not sufficient. And I think it's important to mention here, I'm sure some people listening to this say, well, okay, well, what can be done? Well, first and foremost, there's legislation in Congress right now called the Disclose Act to at least mandate that the spending in the election is disclosed. Even the Citizens United ruling said that that is constitutionally permissible. This should not be a partisan issue. It's the kind of thing that even Justice Antonin Scalia said is necessary to preserve democracy. What is not on the agenda and what got like one little mention at the Democratic convention from Bernie Sanders, of course, from Bernie Sanders, was public financing of elections. That twice in my lifetime, the Congress got extremely close to publicly financing congressional elections. This is like completely forgotten history. One time it passed through the Senate right after Watergate, and another time it passed through Congress and a version of it and got to the president's desk in the aftermath of the Keating 5 scandal, got to President George H.W. Bush's desk, and he vetoed it. And the reason public financing is so important is because it will give candidates a way to run well-funded campaigns for office without having to rely on private donors and money that comes with the expectations of favors. To me, the fact that we don't even talk about that, that's got to change.
I want to try to get at why it is that politicians have stopped talking about this. And I think Trump kind of answers that question in a way. So let's go back to that ad and the Harris campaign's efforts to target Trump and Project 2025. I think a big problem for Democrats is that Trump kind of codes as anti-establishment to a lot of voters. So Democrats maybe think attacking things like the big oil shakedown just won't really land. And that's pretty perverse because while Trump did kind of campaign against financial elites and their corrupt influence in 2016, said that he was an insider who understood how the corrupt system worked, he never followed up on that, and now he's completely dropped all of it and is openly engaged in elite double dealing himself. I mean, just as an example, David, House Democrats actually passed some pretty good stuff during the Trump presidency that would have, shored up the system against presidential corruption, expanded democracy, and so forth. You're familiar with all those bills. No one gave a shit, right? I mean, nobody said, oh, wow, Democrats are trying to, do something about Trumpian corruption. It just looked like message bills or whatever, right? And maybe they were to some degree, but you see the conundrum. It just, I don't know how you make voters care about this stuff, especially when someone like Trump can just say, I'm going to take on the big guys, I'm going to take on the fat cats, and everyone believes it.
I think it's a fair question, and I think part of the problem with the government becoming so obviously dominated by money, so obviously in many ways corrupt, is that it sows a cynicism and a nihilism in which lots and lots of people basically say, listen, corruption is the way it is. Corruption can't be fixed. They're both corrupt. So I'm just going to vote for the human bomb who promises to blow it all up. And I think that level of it's understandable. I'm not running it down. I'm not like, I get it. Like, I get that feeling of helplessness. But I also think that, again, there are ways to make this better. There really are. And I think you're right, Greg, making the case that things can improve, that there can be a better government, that good governance is actually possible. I think that's got to start now. I mean, we're 20, 30, 40 years behind the ball here. And you're right. It's kind of a crazy quandary that the more corrupt the system is, the better the political environment it is for very, very corrupt people to just say, it's all corrupt. Just elect me. I'll blow it all up and be even more corrupt. Right. I mean, that's a really, really dark downward spiral. How to break through that? I would say one thing in reporting this series that I come back to, there was one time in my lifetime that I can remember that the corruption issue was really elevated to a national level. And maybe I'm showing my age here, but it was in 1999 and 2000 when John McCain decided to make an anti-corruption crusade the centerpiece of his political identity. I think this is like forgotten. Everyone remembers the John McCain of 2009 and 2008, et cetera, et cetera. John McCain of 1999 and 2000 is kind of an amazing story.
Just let me interpose this. This is why John McCain sank the effort to repeal the Affordable Care Act in 2017. It was a corruption argument.
Exactly. I think people have completely forgotten this. John McCain was one of the Keating 5. he was one of the senators who pressured a federal banking regulator on behalf of a donor. It was a highly embarrassing scandal for him. It was a huge scandal in Washington at the time, which is kind of funny to think about because the Keating Five is the way politics is now practiced sort of routinely now. McCain comes out of that scandal with the zeal of a convert to the campaign finance cause and decides to make this the central defining part of his political identity. He joins up with Russ Feingold. They push the McCain-Feingold bill, not a perfect bill, but to try to start chipping away, cutting off a flood of unregulated corporate money into politics. He runs for president after the bill is stymied. He runs explicitly on this. We have his former chief of staff talk to us on Master Plan about how his aides told him not to do this. Nobody cared. And he went to New Hampshire and everybody cared. It was a hugely resonant issue. McCain loses against the human personification of money politics, George W. Bush, in that primary. But he's so effective in that campaign that he compels even Bush to say he supports the bill, and Bush ultimately signs it. And the Supreme Court, the pre-John Roberts Supreme Court, actually upholds it. Now, I bring that up not to say, I'm pie in the sky, oh, that's going to happen again, tomorrow. It's only to say that the politics of corruption can change very fast. That John McCain kind of came out of nowhere and was able to make that a big issue. And if I'm an eternal optimist, I think there's another person that somewhere, I don't know who it is, that can happen again. It's just, what's the threshold point? How corrupt do things have to get in order for the pendulum to swing back towards reform?
It's a damn good question. Just to close this out, I think that there's actually kind of an opportunity in a way with this Project 2025 stuff. If you look at an ad like this one, right, the Harris ad, which just, it puts Trump's face on the whole thing. It doesn't say, he will erode the independence of this federal agency, right? Even though that's what the ad says about the Justice Department. But it says he will go after his enemies, and he's a crazed lunatic who wants to be a dictator. And if you can kind of get the public to associate that with an anti-corruption argument, then maybe you have a chance at getting it to resonate. Now, I don't want to be too pessimistic here. As you say, it does break through at times. I would add, by the way, to your history, that in 2006, corruption was a pretty big reason that Democrats were able to flip the House and the Senate.
Good point. Jack Abramoff, K Street Project, et cetera, et cetera. Totally.
They campaigned hard on that stuff. And I think the Iraq War obviously helped, but corruption was important in that election, and people voted on it. I'm pretty sure that's what the postmortem showed. But the bottom line is you can get people to care about it. I think maybe Project 2025 provides this new opening, is what I'm saying.
Well, I will join into the optimism and say this. I think that the arrogance of the conservative movement, the Republican donor class, in writing this all down in 922 pages and saying, this is a document of corruption. It really is, right? If you tie the who's funding it to who's writing it to what they're going to get, it is like a blueprint for it is the culmination of the master plan to legalize corruption and do whatever they want. And the arrogance in just writing it all down, maybe that's the sort of rock bottom, that they've become so arrogant that the pendulum starts to swing back because they kind of overstepped. Now, I want to add one other thing, which I think is important. My hope is that the Project 2025 debacle, and it's becoming a political debacle for the Republicans, my hope is that the Democrats their takeaway isn't, hey, we should not write anything down, we shouldn't propose anything. Right. That should not be the takeaway. The takeaway should be you shouldn't write down an explicit plan to help your donors take over the government, enrich themselves, and destroy the country with an extremist policy program. You should put down a policy program that's good for people. In other words, the sort of political crime here on the Republicans' part is that they wrote down an extremist, corrupt agenda. Not that they just wrote down any agenda. It's the extremism and the corruption.
I do want to add to what you said there and support your point about the possibility of a backlash to the hubris of the conservative movement, which is that the Supreme Court has just engaged in this extraordinary display of open, contemptuous corruption that is really turning the public against it, and I think opens a window for maybe reform depending on what happens in this election. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic.
No. I think you're. There's so many different threads, right? I mean, I guess
Yeah.
what we're saying is, it's not like Project 2025 and the corruption that it embodies is some anomaly. Like, wow, I didn't. Wow, this is just weird. There's so many layers. There's like, think of the average voter has heard about the absolutely grotesque corruption at the Supreme Court. The average voter has probably heard something about Trump's corrupt dealings. Now the average voter is hearing about, wow, they wrote down an entire blueprint for corruption, right? I mean, it's coming at the average voter in all different directions. And I think what Trump is probably going to try to do is revert back to the old, listen, I'm at least anti-establishment. I admit that the system is corrupt, but I'll be your corrupt guy. Like, that's going to be his play. But I think, look, I think that all of the layers could create a real possibility of reform out of this election. Like, I mean, again, I may sound pie in the sky here, but I would love to see if Kamala Harris wins, the first thing the Democrats do is try to pass the Disclose Act, try to actually pass something on corruption itself, like an anti-corruption policy. Like, I think that would be a really good idea. It's got the support of, I mean, look at polls. I mean, it's not like it's an unpopular idea. That's what you'd love to see.
And I want to say that Kamala Harris actually would be a very good messenger for this stuff, given her prosecutorial past. Everybody, make sure to check out this new podcast, Master Plan. It's a deep dive into more than a half century of legalized corruption in Washington, and it explains our current moment. David Sirota, thanks so much for coming on with us today.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler and the DSR Network.